Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 36,778 people from 160 countries and is supported by 511 organisations. We have many volunteer activists, including many country contacts from every continent, engaged in defending women's rights. Do join us as a volunteer. Today, we've got Sheila Jeffreys from the UK, and she's going to talk on the problem with free speech. And then we're going to hear from Kathleen Lowrey from Canada, who's going to talk Gynepology, yeah? At the Anthropology of women, because it's a new word for me, it's difficult to say. And then we're going to have Leah Carvalho from Portugal, Gender Identity in Portugal Digital Guidelines. Sheila Jeffreys is a radical feminist writer and activist who has worked mainly against male violence and for lesbian feminism. She joined her first women's liberation movement group in the UK in 1973. She's the author of 11 books on issues such as the history of sexuality, lesbian feminism, prostitution, gay men's politics, beauty practices, the threat of patriarchal religion to women's rights, and the politics of transgenderism. She's a director of Women's Declaration International and is talking today on the problem with free speech.
I'm going to be talking about free speech, and I'm going to do that because I've noticed that many feminists are working in or have set up organizations that are dedicated to the promotion of something called free speech, and this worries me a bit. The development is in response to the threat posed by transvestite activism to the speech of women and feminism, and there is no doubt that transvestite activism poses a severe threat to women's freedom of expression, and I'm going to talk about that today. So the way in which women and men relate to the issue of free speech is extremely different. And that's what worries me. If we try to suggest that it might be in any way the same, and I will argue that feminists need to bear this in mind when using the concept of free speech. Men have historically campaigned for the right to freedom of speech or freedom of expression in order to take part in political struggle against oppressive systems of government. In other words, against other more powerful men. Women, on the other hand, have fought and continue to fight for the right to speak against systems of male domination that have sought to shut us down in order to control and rule us. So those things are quite different. Now, I'm going to give some examples that illustrate the big difference between men and women in relation to free speech. The first of these is the punishment of women, called the scold's bridle, which seems to have been used in the 15th to the 18th centuries in the UK and doubtless elsewhere. And in this practice, women, and of course it was always women so far as we know, were punished for speaking too much or in the wrong way by having an iron torture implement fastened on their heads with a metal bar inside, which suppressed their tongues. This seems to be the origin of the expression, hold your tongue, meaning shut up. So this is a description of how the bridle worked from a museum where the bridle was on display. Once the bridle was placed on the woman, she was then led through the streets by the beadle or chained in the market cross. Apart from the obvious fear and pain of wearing it, the bridle was intended to humiliate the wearer. Bystanders would jeer, hurl insults, throw objects, spit at, and even urinate on women whilst they were chained. And perhaps even more cruelly, a woman who was forced to wear the bridle at home as a deterrent to her children would present a terrifying picture with the distortion of her features and probable laceration of tongue and lips. This barbarous instrument of torture has the dubious honour of being responsible for the saying, "Hold your tongue." It's a visceral reference to the metal plate that held down a woman's tongue. This is a picture of the bridle, and there are bridles in quite a lot of museums, of course. They take slightly different forms, and it'd be interesting to see how they did work in other areas of Europe and so on, because I'm sure they would have done so. Now, a skeleton bridle isn't necessary, of course, we know, in terms of the oppression of women, because there are all kinds of social mechanisms that have always been used to silence women and girls, so that in most cases they wouldn't dream of speaking up. And these are mechanisms used for women in particular. And my parents, for instance, told me that little girls should be seen and not heard, and I hid behind the sofa when we had relatives to visit, so I wouldn't make any mistakes. And there's no history really of the silencing of men or recognised methods to do so. Men are not veiled, for instance, and hidden from sight. So the next example I want to look at how freedom of speech is different for women and men is the fact that the silencing of women provides men with sexual pleasure, and a variety of gags is used for this purpose. So this is a picture of a woman in a ball gag. This is very normal. It's commonly used in BDSM, and all over the internet you will find very, very many different kinds of gags and for sale. I mean, some are tartan, for instance, some are shaped like a golf ball, and so on. So there's a lot of variety. And it has been very, very ordinary in male sexuality and what men seek to do to women. And there's a very famous book from the sexual revolution times from 1973 by Alex Comfort called The Joy of Sex. And this book was published all over the world, many, 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 many languages. So it's a guide for ordinary marital sex. This is safe. This is from a man who uses these gags, obviously, on his girlfriend. And he's saying, this is on Reddit, a Reddit thread, "Is it safe for women with asthma to wear a ball gag? Can you deliver the inhaler through the nose in an emergency? Just wondering, e.g. if it takes time and I end up fumbling the lock." Well, the situation actually is that he might be able to kill his girlfriend in this way, because there is no way that he would be able to use this with a woman with asthma safely. But I think this just shows how ordinary it is, and how men see themselves as probably kindly for taking some care to actually not kill their girlfriends in these ways. Yes, this is what he has to say in 1973. So this is ordinary sex all over the world, just normal. "Gagging and being gagged turns most men on. Most women hate to profess to hate it in prospect, but the expression of erotic astonishment on the face of a well-gagged woman when she finds she can only mew is irresistible to most men's rape instincts." So what's interesting about this quote, which I have in my book Anti-Climax, is that he starts off saying gagging and being gagged turns most men on, and then he goes straight to why that is the case, because women profess to hate it, but they look absolutely terrified when they're gagged and they cannot speak. So it seems to me this is a very, very different relationship that men and women have to being silenced, when it is this sort of punishment and restriction of women is sexually exciting to men, but there's not really any suggestion that women would be in a position to gag men in this way, or that it would be exciting for women to do so. Now, I want to go on to talk about then, having established that it is very different for men and women, to think about the history of feminism and free speech, because there is quite a big history of this, and which some may not be so well aware of. So the right to what came to be called freedom of expression, of course, but is in the American Constitution called freedom of speech, so it's called different things in different places, was a fundamental goal of political movements against the overweening powers of the state throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And the upshot of this was that this right was seen as vital when the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, or Declaration of Human Rights, was created in 1948. And it's in the 1966 Convention on Civil and Political Rights, in which Article 19 says that the right to hold and freely express opinions without interference is a fundamental right. Now, that's all very noble, but as with all the other rights that exist in the original UN conventions, only the rights of men were meant, and only in relation to the powers of the state. Most of what men do to women was not included because it's done in private by men who are partners of those women, and it's not something that's carried out by the state, it's carried out by men. Now, the feminists who created the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 1979 included freedom of expression. They stated that women should have the same speech rights as men. And we include freedom of expression in our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. It's Article 4 in there, which is based on Article 19 of the ICCPR. But there's a very different kind of right. Apart from the right to speak out politically about changing the political situation in a state, which is what I'm going to call today men's right to talk dirty about women. And that's, of course, largely achieved now. It's a specifically masculine right, and men have campaigned for it for a very long time. That means, talking dirty means, i.e. in degrading sexual terms about women. For instance, when men went to the smoking room after dinner in grand houses, they looked at early forms of pornography there, and they talked about prostitution. And this was not just pleasurable and sexually exciting, but enabled them to bond through their hatred of women. And I've just finished reading, for instance, a most remarkable book called Wifedom by Anna Funder about Eileen, the wife of George Orwell. And Funder makes it clear that not only did he use prostituted girls and women in many, many countries, but he also enjoyed talking about their use with other men. He liked to talk dirty. He liked to talk about what the teenage girls that he bought in Morocco, for instance, smelt and felt like. So it's important, I think, that we know that great male heroes of social justice like to talk dirty just as other men do. So talking dirty has always been vital to men, but not especially seen as respectable, not usually seen as respectable in public places in front of women. And that all changed in the mid-20th century. In the 20th century, men who wrote literary pornography and male campaigners for free speech conducted a fierce and successful campaign to lift all restrictions from men's right to talk dirty about women in public. And I wrote about this in my chapter on de-censorship in my book, Anti-Climax in 1990. I argued that the so-called sexual revolution, i.e. the realization of men's sex right to use women as freely as they wished in the 1960s, had to be preceded by the removal of censorship of men's sexual writing about women. And they campaigned for novels such as Lolita, which normalized the sexual use of young teenage girls, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which romanticized the degradation of an upper-class woman by a gamekeeper through anal sex, the novels of Henry Miller, and so on. These provided the text for the revolution. They released men's right to show hatred towards women and sexually degrade women. And they consisted of the sexual exploitation of minors and hatred of women of quite an extreme kind. Now, this campaign for men to be able to talk dirty about women was called a campaign against censorship and for free speech. And no distinction was made at the time as to whose speech was involved and what kind of speech this was. The right to talk dirty about women, for instance, was not something that women sought, and they didn't want the right to talk dirty about men. So the pinnacle of these men's success was when the UK theatre critic, Kenneth Tynan, said the word F-U-C-K in a live debate on BBC television in 1965, a crucial moment in free speech. He said, "I doubt if there are any rational people to whom the word F-U-C-K would be particularly diabolical, revolting, or totally forbidden." He was a darling of the left and those who saw themselves as progressive, as all these writers and campaigners for free speech did. In fact, of course, my mother was horrified by the word F-U-C-K at the time, and I am now. I don't ever say it, but I spell it out. And when I was lecturing and had to use that word, I would spell it out, because the word has attached to it a particular vicious and pointed violence against women. It's not a neutral word. Rarely do people seriously talk about women, F-U-C-K-I-N-G, men. It means to penetrate, preferably with considerable force, a woman's body. And it's so freighted with hatred of women that I can't use it innocently, although I know many do. So the words C-U-N-T and F-U-C-K are the words of men's liberation. Their liberation to treat women as despicable and as pure sex. And women are seen as ridiculous prudes if they object to these forms of speech. There are no words of this kind that women do or can use against men that are freighted with sexual hatred of men. There are not such words. So the idea of free speech and its inviolability was used to justify pornography, both in its textual and visual form. It was the basis of the pornography revolution. All of it was part of men's sexual rights justified by free speech. In the 1970s, after decensorship was achieved, the industry of pornography took off. Now men's speech about women in the form of pornography is completely free. They have come a long way with their rights. And of course, men's pornography is political speech, but not usually understood as such. It's the propaganda of woman hating, and it's a mainstay of the continued subordination of women in the present. And all states protect it pretty much as a form of freedom of expression. They don't exactly use those terms, but no states seriously try to do anything about pornography, not really. They say it's too difficult and so on. Now, I want to go on to talk about how the speech of pornography and other men's sexual literature is defended. They say that they talk about something called the marketplace of ideas. This is very much talked about in the 50s and 60s by male liberals in their defense and their campaigns. Behind the promotion of free speech is the idea of the marketplace of ideas. And they said that free speech was fair to everyone because everyone had an equal right to set out their stall in the marketplace of ideas, and this right should be protected. This is, of course, an absurd idea because though everybody may have an equal right, there's no way that everyone has an equal opportunity. Women have been excluded from all forms of media and are still unlikely to control newspapers and other media channels. Media is controlled by money on a scale not usually available to women. In order for women to have an equal opportunity to take part in the marketplace of ideas, girls would have to be trained from birth to take part equally and speak. And currently, men dominate all conversation, let alone other kinds of speech. Women would have to be equally prominent and controlling of all forms of media to do this. For such equality to exist, women's ideas, thoughts, and feelings about themselves, their bodies, and the world would have to have equal salience to those of men. And of course, it's quite difficult to imagine this at the moment. In relation to pornography, the marketplace idea makes no sense at all. Some men do reply to feminist critique of porn by saying, well, you can do it too, create your own porn. And indeed, some women, particularly those who've been abused in porn and prostitution themselves, have created porn, ostensibly for lesbians or for men, using other women who are trying to survive in the industry. There's no industry of porn, however, created of boys and men for other women by women. There's no industry of porn in which the prolapsed anuses of young men and boys are displayed for women to masturbate to. You see the problem. Porn is, as Kathleen Lowrey says, the propaganda of woman hatred, and this hatred is very sexually exciting to the men. who are happy to shut themselves in their room and masturbate to it for hours. It's not possible to imagine women creating an industry of films and photos of young men because women are not sexually excited by the degradation of boys, and there's not a plentiful supply of teenage boys to enter the industry for them. So porn is created out of the sexualization of women's oppression, and the opposite is not possible for women, because men are not sexually exploited. Now, pornography, feminists have always said, silences women. It's a form of the silencing. In the US in particular, male pornography campaigners and producers argued in defense of porn using the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which protects free speech. And such a defense wasn't quite as easy in Britain because there isn't a constitution. Now, US feminists who campaigned to end pornography had to develop arguments that would fight this idea that it was about free speech. I'm going to use some arguments from Catherine McKinnon's book, Only Words, which is specifically written in opposition to the view that pornography is about free speech. So it's taking part in that particular American argument. And she makes some useful arguments. She says, for instance, that pornography is not only words, or not only words in the sense that it doesn't matter. She says social inequality is substantially created and enforced. That is done through words and images. A sign saying whites only is only words. Words unproblematically treated as acts in the inequality context include you're fired, help wanted, male. Sleep with me and I'll give you an A, fuck me or you're fired. And she says that pornography silences women. With pornography, men masturbate to women being exposed, humiliated, violated, degraded, mutilated, dismembered, bound, gagged, tortured, and killed. She argues, and feminists have argued, that this silences women. Women are unable to have the power of serious, ordinary speech in the way that men do in this context. For instance, if women want to stand up in Parliament and speak, if they want to speak in a meeting, the men in that meeting will have probably spent many hours that day or that week looking at women degraded in terrible ways and often tortured. So women are not in a position to have equal speech in that situation. So I'm going to give some examples of the effect of pornography on women's speech. This is a poster used in the election campaign in 2013 in Australia, where Julia Gillard was facing a man called Tony Abbott in an election to be Prime Minister. This is Julia, and it says sack the crack. This is a poster that was used publicly in the election campaign. Crack is a word that was obviously meaning women. It must be the way that men talk about women, but most of us don't know how men talk dirty about women. We don't know the words they use, but that obviously I would say relates to women's genitals. This is Tony Abbott, who became the Prime Minister, in front of a poster which says Jew liar, because she was called Jew liar. And she was called Bob Brown's bitch. Bob Brown was a Greens party senator. He was much hated, a gay man. But that was seen as completely reasonable to be in front of that poster. This is a cartoon created by Larry Pickering. He was the most famous cartoonist and of the major newspaper in Australia. He did hundreds of these things. I don't know if they were published in the newspaper, but he did them for his own pleasure. Obviously, they were published somewhere. So this is Julia Gillard naked with a dildo, and it says, time for your daily briefing, Bob. So he was a gay man, so this was seen as funny. And the daily briefing would be, you know, where the party leaders talk to each other. So that was supposed to how this was supposed to happen. So the question I'm asking really is whether it's possible for women to have equal speech in a situation where the context is created by pornography, created by this terrible hatred of them. Clearly that wasn't possible in Australia. And it's a good question as to whether it would be possible in other countries in a way that it was not there. Now, the feminist interest in free speech is the result of the new campaign against our speech by transvestite activists. But the men who promote free speech are most generally quite conservative men and would probably never imagine that their use and love of pornography is anything but admirable. So there's a powerful contradiction here. The onslaught, though, of transvestite activism has created a new and extremely severe threat to women's freedom of expression, as we explain in the Women's Declaration. It does look as if the transvestite activists didn't expect women to speak out against them, but women did on a huge scale, and we continue to, and they didn't expect this trouble. So in response to our determination to speak out, to say that, yes, we are actually women and that matters, and so on, they have developed various ways of attacking us, and we have heard about many of these ways on Feminist Question Time, so we probably don't need to go through them all here. They have, of course, created their new language, gender, which means their sexual fantasy of sexual masochism, and many other forms of language that make it very difficult for women to speak about themselves, to describe their own bodies and their own concerns, and so on. They have developed all kinds of methods of trying to control our speech and get rid of our speech, and we know many, many examples of them. But another way, of course, that they try to fight us is in the form of insults and threats of rape, threats of murder online in social media, on placards at our protests, on our office doors. Now, presently, there is no easy way to counter this, not that there would be an easy way, because women are not a category in the legislation that has been and is continuing to be rolled out on hate speech and hate crime. Women aren't there. So we don't have that kind of recourse that men in various categories might have. So I'm just going to say something about hate speech. The exclusion of women from hate crime and hate speech laws is extraordinary. It's a deliberate exclusion because the categories included are usually those that states cover in their equality and anti-discrimination laws, where sex is, up till now, generally included. So there's a determined act of power involved to remove women from this list. They know women should be there, but they determinedly remove them. And some feminists have argued that the category of sex should be included, and some feminists have said that we shouldn't seek to achieve this because hate crimes against women are best dealt with through other laws which specifically target them, such as stalking, assault, sexual harassment, and so on. They pointed out that the great majority of crimes against women are carried out in the home by intimates, and hate crime laws are directed acts carried out in public space, so they wouldn't be suitable. Another criticism of these laws that some feminists have made is that the reason that women are targeted for violence and abuse is not a form of individual hate, so women shouldn't be in there. They're not suitable for women, but it's systemic misogyny. And they say that, women are not attacked because some individuals have an unreasonable prejudice against a particular social group. So these laws are perhaps not really suitable. And a good example, though, of the fact that men are likely to use these laws, there's not a great deal of evidence that they're using them yet in the countries that have very recently put them through. But a good example of the way that transvestites are likely to use them is the fact that men in the UK, for instance, transvestites are constantly using the law against women. It was revealed last week that the man Anthony Halliday, who has pursued Caroline Farrow under the name Stephanie Hayden for a long time and made her life a misery, is a registered child sex offender who pleaded guilty in 1999 to 2 offences against a 14-year-old boy. A couple of years later was in court for assaulting a man in a car park over a parking space. This is the type of transvestite who is presently harassing women in the UK by using the law. England doesn't yet have hate crime legislation. Scotland, as we'll see in a moment, does. In 2022, Caroline had a knock on the door as she was preparing roast chicken for her family's evening meal when 2 police arrived to arrest her. And the harassment of her has been persistent and gone on a long time. And this particular man has done this he's taken legal action against 24 people and filed 40 complaints, including against the Mail on Sunday. So this is this paedophile. So there are many, unfortunately, transvestite vexatious litigants like him seeking to make women's lives a misery and dragging them through the courts in many other countries, as we know from these seminars such as Norway, Sweden, Germany, Brazil. And where once the problem for women was managing to get their speech heard, it is now that they will be harshly punished for expressing their opinions about women's sex-based rights and biological reality. So it's not exactly a scourge bridle now, but these men are using the law in every way they can, and it's likely that they will use hate crimes legislation, and this is why they are pushing for hate crimes legislation. So I'm just going to talk for a moment about hate crimes legislation in Scotland, which went through in 2021. This is the 2021 law. New law creates an offence of behaving in a threatening, abusive, or insulting manner, or communicating in a similar manner to another person in a way which intends to stir up hatred against a group of persons, and covers age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. And it also creates the offence of inflammatory material. Now, what is interesting about this is there's something interesting in here. Look at sex characteristics. Sex characteristics, which is a terminology that the transvestite activists seek to get into all legislation, appears to mean, they say it means intersexuality. So it would mean a man who presumably, because male is generally the predominant underlying sex of those seen as intersexual, would be protected in going with the penis into the women's toilets. Sex characteristics doesn't mean sexual characteristics that women may have, because women are not in the legislation. And the bill does, however, allow for women to be added as a category at a later date. Isn't that nice? You know, they might need to add women in. The problem is, of course, women are half the population, and those who do not want to add women into this legislation pretty much everywhere say if women were added in, it would explode the idea of hate speech. Yes, it would, and perhaps it should, because obviously women are those who are most likely to and do suffer all of this, and pornography would be a problem as well, and so on. So maybe hate crime legislation, hate speech legislation is entirely unsuitable, because if it can't include women, then how is it useful? If it can't include the most serious problem that we have. Another interesting problem with the Scottish bill, as with all bills of this kind, is that, well, not necessarily, no, actually this is a new problem. It's a problem with this bill in particular. The man who is now the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, he was the Secretary of State for Justice who got this bill through. And he said it was important that this bill would cover what happened at the dining table. So in your living room, your children might say to their father, no, of course you're not a woman, you're obviously a man, you're our dad. That could, in theory, who knows, fall within this bill, because it's supposed to cover what's going on inside the home. That's unusual, because normally hate speech covers what happens outside. And indeed, around the Scottish legislation, the whole issue of the fact that women were not there but transvestites was brought up. The spokeswoman of the feminist group For Women Scotland, Susan Smith, said she was concerned the definition included men who were transvestites, with the effect that you get this bizarre situation that something being done for arousal is protected under hate crime legislation, but women are not there. So there's a protection of a sexual fantasy, and men who don't want to be offended by having their sexual fantasy called into question, but actual real women, like those cartoons about Julia Gillard, for instance, are not within this legislation. When feminists set up, let's just think about whether it's okay to be setting up free speech organizations or joining them. I know lots of women are, and I don't want to be, especially critical. I understand exactly why women are, because in this situation, you would feel you needed to do something. But when feminists set up free speech organizations or join those already set up by men, we are hostages in a way. We're wanting to use the influence that those men, often very establishment and conservative men, wield on the issue of free speech to help protect ourselves. And these men are often happy to support our cause of being able to speak about biology. And they can be very useful to us in that way. And some are prepared to recognize that it's women who are particularly attacked for using our speech. But they're very unlikely to be interested in countering the speech that they are, the talking dirty they probably use in their homes and behind a bedroom door in the evening and so on, which is using pornography in which women are being sexually tortured. They're very unlikely to want to do anything about that. So I think we've got a contradiction at the end. As we can use these men about certain kinds of speech that they are prepared to, and we are often very pleased that they are prepared to defend, but the other forms of speech that they want to use about women, they are certainly not going to see those as in any way harmful to us. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
We'll go to our next speaker now, which is Kathleen Lowrey. Kathleen Lowrey is an anthropologist who has done most of her fieldwork in lowland Bolivia. She's still an associate professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, but in 2020 was dismissed from an administrative position following a campaign by students, faculty, and administrators who wanted her punished for refusing to adhere to gender ideology. Her faculty union is sustaining an ongoing fight on her behalf regarding this dismissal. Kathleen has written about gender ideology and trans activism for the feminist outlets Feminist Current, Gender Dissent, and 4W. And thank you so much, Kathleen. And Kathleen's talk today is Gynepology, the Anthropology of Women. So over to you.
So gynepology is not, it's not kind of a real word. It's a word that I've made up to think about what would anthropology look like if we kind of told the human story through women. So there was a fluorescence of this. I feel like I'm gonna shrink myself up there. Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys can see, but there was a fluorescence of interest at looking at the human story through women in the 1970s. So this is the cover of an edited volume. I think it was actually published in 1981, but I believe it's the kind of proceedings of a conference that responded to an earlier conference called Man the Hunter. And then a group of scholars, mostly women scholars, came together and thought, well, what if we looked at what women are up to? Many of you probably know that studies have shown that in hunter-gathering societies, women's gathering actually provides most of the calories, although men's hunting is exciting because people like meat. Anyway, so there was a lot of interesting work in the 1970s. And then it began to be quashed by the 1980s. So this is something one sees in the feminist movement, one sees in scholarship generally, and it definitely happened in anthropology also. A really famous essay that I think did part of this work of squashing was an essay called the Cyborg Manifesto, or a Manifesto for Cyborgs, by an anthropologist named Donna Haraway. And it ends by saying, though both are bound in the spiral dance, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. Now, this essay has become interpreted as a sort of feminist anthropologist embracing technology, despite understanding that technology is problematic, that it seems to come out of a masculine patriarchal world, but women can't reject technology. So this sort of modern progressive feminism. And I think what's been lost in that is how much Donna Haraway was really kicking a feminist tradition that had begun to emerge in the 1970s right in the teeth. So Donna Haraway is a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She wrote this essay in the early 1980s. In the late 1970s, there had been a major conference at Santa Cruz. I believe it was called Women and the Goddess. Carol Christ, who some of you may be aware of, she died not so long ago, was a major figure in this. So there's a way in which, with this essay, Donna Haraway was really stiff-arming that kind of work. Now, we can in some ways see the consequences of, was that good or was that bad? I mean, definitely, I would say most anthropologists think the kind of feminism that Donna Haraway articulates is feminist anthropology. I think Donna Haraway was part of feminist anthropology really losing its way, and one can see where we are now. So some of you may have heard a recent study came out saying that they'd done a restudy of women's practices in traditional societies, and they said it turns out in 80% of societies that we looked at, women actually do a lot of hunting. This is just not true. And for those of you who are interested, you can text me in the chat and I can send you a link to the debunking of this. But what's disturbing about that kind of study is it's a study that wants to make, sort of sets whatever men do as the standard of humanity, and then says like, women do that thing too, which I think that's just not feminism. That's not pro-woman to kind of say, whatever men do, women also do that thing, and we fit into that category. That we've lost our way if that's what we're doing. Another example of how anthropology has lost its way is, some of you may have come across this book, Feminism Against Family by Sophie Lewis. Sophie Lewis is a big fan of Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway blurbed Sophie Lewis's book. So in this book, what she's advocating for is what she calls full surrogacy now. In the acknowledgments to the book, Sophie Lewis is married to a man who identifies as a woman, and she calls that man, she thanks him for being her soul, which is just so pathetic. I mean, the most surrendered of Christian wives still thinks she has her own soul, but Sophie Lewis thinks her husband, who identifies as a man, is her soul. And in the book, she refers to pregnant women as gestators, and she says, well, right now there's a problem with surrogacy because of economic inequality, but really what we need to do is we just need to pay surrogates better for the work of baby making, and we need to distribute the work of baby making more equitably. And of course, we also have to distribute the babies more equitably, so people shouldn't be raised by there. It's just completely grotesquely misogynist, but this is what now counts as feminist anthropology. All right, we can also see this in popular culture. So girl power being modeled on male violence, which I think is what motivates that study, like, women are traditionally hunters too. These fantasies of what would it look like to have strong women, and what it looks like is women who engage in male violence. I haven't seen The Woman King, but my daughter watched it on a flight, and I watched part of it over her shoulder. And Viola Davis is in great shape in the movie, but there's scenes where she like totally kicks ass of men that are 20 years younger than her and twice her size. It's just ludicrous. And of course, it's also ludicrous that if you were going into battle, this is not armor, right? Something that like shows your cleavage and your belly. I don't need to tell this crowd about that. And girls are really propagandized with this. I don't know if anybody has watched the trailer for this new movie Bottoms that's supposed to be like, it's a groovy lesbian movie for teen girls. It's so horrible. The plot of the movie is two teenage girls start a fight club, which is, I mean, of course, like what else would teenage girls want to do but start a fight club? And the reason they start the fight club is because they want to seduce the hot Sheila. I mean, it's basically a teen boy sex movie with girls slotted in to the traditional like gross, sniggering teen boy sex movie roles. The women who produced and directed it, they're at least in their late 20s, if not, they're not teenagers. You all know all about teen girls being propagandized with trans joy. So this, I don't need to tell this crowd that feminism has kind of lost its way. Feminist scholarship has lost its way. Feminist anthropology has lost its way. But this is not a depressing talk. This is a cheerful talk. So hope is on the way, and some of the hope is coming from unexpected corners. So 1970s feminists were rightly wary of evolutionary explanations. This was the era of E.O. Wilson's sociobiology, sociobiology. Since his death, E.O. Wilson has been recast as this like cuddly grandpa figure. His vision of evolution was really obsessed with violence and death. It was super sexist and misogynist. He was a professional entomologist. Supposedly he was a bug lover, but this supposed bug lover, one of his really famous early experiments was surrounding a mangrove island in Florida and dousing it with pesticide until every single critter on it died, and then seeing how it got repopulated. I think if you were a biologist who loves life, you would have designed a different kind of experiment. Anyway, to go specifically to anthropology, the sort of traditional account of hominin evolution is the so-called savanna hypothesis, that are kind of the primate ancestors who evolved into humans. They used to be brachiators who lived in trees, and then there was a period of drought, and they had to come down from the trees and learn to live on the savanna. And a central part of this story is that humans developed bipedalism because they started to hunt. They became persistence hunters, which means it's a hunting method where you run critters down over several days. You're not faster than them, but you keep chasing them until they become exhausted and kind of collapse. Then you bash them on the head. This is something that has been practiced into modern times by some hunter-gathering groups. So it's not that this hunting adaptation doesn't exist, but the notion that it was at the center of how we became bipedal, how we acquired our big brains. This is a particular story, and it's a story that says we were lean, mean hunting machines on an arid savanna. Life was really hard. Thank God and it was mostly the men doing this persistence hunting. Thank God for them, because they caught enough meat, and then they dragged that meat back home, and their mates were like, "Oh, sweetie, you're the best. Please give me some meat." And like the women and children just sat on the savanna waiting for the meat to be. Everybody has come across this story. It is still the mainstream story in anthropology. However, an old alternative is currently winning new support, and this is exciting, and I think something that feminists should be aware of. Many of you probably know Elaine Morgan's work. If you don't and you're interested in this kind of thing, you should read it. Her first book was The Descent of Woman, published in 1972. She articulates what she called the aquatic ape hypothesis, which I'll explain in a second. She wasn't the first to put it forward. The first was a guy named Alistair Hardy, who made it public in 1960. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. Elaine Morgan, who had read a ton of these sort of savanna hypothesis stories and saw a lot of holes in these stories and was extremely annoyed by those holes, then wrote The Descent of Woman. In response, the book is hilarious. It remains a terrific, terrific read. She did make some scientific errors in it, and because she continued to develop what she called the aquatic ape hypothesis pretty much for the rest of her life. She wrote their subsequent books, The Descent of the Child, The Scars of Evolution. There's a book called The Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. This book became very famous. It was very widely read, and then she got really attacked. And she continued to respond to kind of new scientific development. She responded to criticisms of some of the errors she had made. So the later books are also good reads, but they're written in a more serious tone. So if you just want to get the overall overview, understanding that it does have some mistakes in it, Descent of Woman remains the entertaining kind of go-to read. But I will say within professional anthropology, the aquatic ape hypothesis was long treated as just crazy. So as equivalent to saying that aliens built the pyramids, that kind of really nutty out there idea. However, and I would say mostly outside of anthropology, a lot of evidence has been accumulating that the aquatic ape hypothesis might in fact be correct. It's no longer called the aquatic ape hypothesis. That's become untouchable because so much scorn was heaped on it. There's a 2016 BBC Radio 4 show the Waterside Ape with David Attenborough. It's a 2-part radio show. You can listen to it in the car. It's great. I highly recommend it. I cannot summarize all of the evidence that it presents today, but if you're interested, seriously, it's very interesting. You'll really enjoy it. But I want to go through some of the stuff these researchers have been finding. So one of the things they've been very interested in is fat. So fat was at the heart of the aquatic ape hypothesis. Alistair Hardy was a physiologist, and he had been on an expedition as a young man where they dissected aquatic sea mammals, and he noticed that they have blubber under their skins. They have this tightly bonded fat layer under their skins, and human beings also have fat tightly bonded to our skins, which is chimpanzees and apes don't have that. So our closest primate relatives don't have that. When Alistair Hardy saw that, he was like, I wonder if one of the things that has made human primates so different from other primates is, did we go through an aquatic stage in our development? But he said himself, he was like, I knew if I said this, I would be treated as a loony. So he waited until quite late in his career. He gave a talk about it in 1960. Elaine Morgan heard about that talk and was like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. And then she really ran with it. Okay, so part of the reason anthropologists are not that interested in this is anthropologists mostly study bones, or archaeologists, physical anthropologists, because bones are what preserves well. Like, bones are what you find. You don't find fat existing, a million years later. You find bones when you're lucky. But other kinds of scientists are interested in fat. So Stephen Cunnane, who wrote Survival of the Fattest, which is such a great book title, he's a physiologist at the University of Sherbrooke. He works on brain nutrition and aging, but he's been interested in the aquatic ape hypothesis since he was an undergraduate. And he says, the human brain is enormously energetically costly, and it requires certain inputs to build. So the one that's probably most familiar to us is iodine. So now we all have iodized salt. Until we had iodized salt, people could get goiters, and there was it had a horrible 19th century name, some like iodine-based cretinism, but a lack of iodine could cause certain kinds of developmental delay. Anyway, Stephen Cunnane points out that to build a fat brain was an evolutionary stage that required particularly kinds of inputs, and these would have been most lavishly available in fish and shellfish. So it just says it makes sense that when we sort of became different, when we became hominins, it makes sense that we would have been living in an environment that allowed us to do that. So humans are fat critters, and that fat is different. I already talked about how it's differently distributed. It's under our skin. Other primates, their fat is around their internal organs. Our brain is the fattiest organ in our bodies, and our babies are very different from other primate babies. So our babies are very, very chubby. So when we look at a gorilla baby, we think it's cute, but we also think it's a little bit disturbing looking because it's so skinny. All right. Morgan had pointed out early on that a lifestyle involving wallowing, swimming, diving is a calorically permissive lifestyle. So she has this great line about water is the only environment in which it costs nothing to be built like a tank. So hippopotamuses have an entirely vegetarian diet, but they're enormous because they require fewer calories to build that big fat body. Aquatic environments are rich in brain food. So what if the origin of the human evolutionary story is not in a context of kind of lean, mean scarcity, but in a context of rich abundance? Well, this changes the way we think about ourselves in a general way. And just to be clear, the waterside ape hypothesis or the aquatic ape hypothesis doesn't say where we went through a stage where we lived like dolphins. It says we went through a stage where we had a kind of hippopotamus-like lifestyle. We were still terrestrial creatures, but we spent a lot of time in the water. So other new research emerging right now, there's a woman named Erika Chagaté. She's a physiologist at Mid-Sweden University. She's tons of publications. And she's really interested in the diving capacity of humans. She suggests it puts us in the range of aquatic mammals like otters and seals. She studied competitive freedivers who competitive freediving. It's so weird that freediving is even possible. That's something that's a recently developed modern sport, but she's also studied human communities that dive a lot for seafood. She hasn't actually worked with a group you may know about, the famous women pearl divers of Korea and Japan. But humans have an unusual capacity to dive deep, spend a lot of time underwater, and the capacities of men and women in this regard seem to be similar. So the record holders in competitive freediving are mostly men, but it's unlike in other sports, men and women's capacities seem to be less stiff. This seems to be a general capacity of human beings. Now, Elaine Morgan had pointed out that voluntary breath control is key to something else that's unique about humans that separates us from our nearest primate relatives, which is that we have speech. One of the things that we've learned about Coco the gorilla is a famous example. Coco learned sign language, and turns out Coco's pretty smart. She can even make jokes in sign language. So their brains are not as big as ours, but their cognitive capacity isn't that different. You can never teach them to speak, though, because they can't voluntarily control their breath. Asking them to learn to speak would be like asking us to pound out a message in Morse code with our hearts. Our heartbeat is not under our voluntary control. Why do we have voluntary breath control? Well, Morgan suggests it's because we went through a stage where we spent a lot of time swimming and diving. Okay. So the upshot is that human evolutionary just so stories have tended to emphasize constraints, scarcity, limits, competition. This lean, mean guy who's a fighting machine on the Pleistocene savanna, like, oh, we shall be eating the paleo diet so we can be skinny. Some of you may have heard about the Liver King who is lying about his diet anyway. But evolution does act in response to constraints, but it also acts in response to possibilities, to openings, to opportunities. Okay, now that's this next part. And Joe, how am I doing on time?
I'm not actually sure because I've just been listening so intently. I haven't looked at the time. It's 7 past. I think you could go on for another, say, 10 minutes. That would be all right.
I'm good. I can do what I want to do in that amount of time. Thank you. I never know if I've babbled too much.
Yeah.
So this isn't specifically related to the aquatic ape hypothesis, but there's a question about human evolution is what was the elementary family unit? The savanna hypothesis supposes that it's man the hunter and his mate and offspring who are like hanging out waiting for their gifts of meat. What if the elementary family unit is a nice chubby granny, her daughters, and their fat babies? So the grandmother hypothesis was first put forward in Kirsten Hawkes in 1997. She had worked with Hadza communities these are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And she noticed that Hadza grandmothers put a tremendous amount of work into feeding and caring for their grandchildren. So she did like caloric studies, like how many calories are provided by, and it turns out grandmas were providing a lot of calories to grandchildren and also doing a lot of care work. Now she thought about this and she was like, this may be an answer to the evolutionary puzzle of menopause, human menopause, which is something else that separates us from our nearest primate relatives. The blunt question is, why don't women just die after we stop being able to reproduce? I'm sure many a man has asked this question, and menopause is often portrayed as like this sort of sad face, like, now you're useless, but you're still alive. And our nearest primate relatives keep having babies into old age. The grandmother hypothesis, I have to say, as much as I think anthropology is a mess in many ways, the grandmother hypothesis now enjoys wide support in anthropology. So what the grandmother hypothesis suggests is it says, and this goes to the facts that the world is currently in denial about the differences between men and women, the organizations of their bodies and their life strategies around different kinds of gamete production. Men produce little gametes. And so if we think about reproductive fitness, their best evolutionary strategy is wide and shallow. So it's possible for them to father most men don't. Most men I won't get into it, but this is a possible evolutionary strategy for men, right? Invest in their offspring, but they investing in your offspring and trying to have as many offspring as possible is a reasonable reproductive fitness strategy for men. Women are the large gamete producers. We gestate the babies, and our babies are very costly to produce. We spend a lot of time, like the last part of pregnancy is just laying fat on your baby, and then the baby gets born and it can't do a damn thing, right? It has this super floppy head where chimpanzee and gorilla babies, as soon as they're skinny, as soon as they're born, they can cling to their mums, they can hold their heads up. Human babies just lay there, really. And so we need help to raise our babies. If we're going to continue to eat ourselves, feed our babies, somebody has to be helping us. The Savannah hypothesis was like, it's the man, which of course it is to some extent, but actually it's probably grandma who's mostly helping. It's not, we can't mother dozens of children, right? It's our best evolutionary strategy is to really do a good job with the number of children we're able to have. And the grandmother strategy is you spend part of your life kind of forwarding your genetic inheritance, supporting your genetic inheritance in the form of helping your daughters raise their babies. And maybe in 2 generations, maybe helping to raise your great granddaughters. And that's probably facilitated the specifically human adaptations of how did we evolve a strategy that's like, oh my God, have a fat baby with a floppy head that it can't hold up. And we humans are unusual in that we allow others to help baby raising. Gorilla and chimpanzee moms just try to touch their babies. They'll chew your arm off. For the first 6 months, the only reason that another gorilla or chimpanzee would want to touch your baby is because they want to kill it. We share parenting. Okay, so I wanted to say so many other things, but for time, I'm just gonna skip to the end at this point. This is to go back to, so the grandmother hypothesis has nothing to do with the waterside ape hypothesis, except maybe it does, because one interesting fact is that there are very few other mammals who experience menopause. Orcas, famously, a few other sea mammal species. These are creatures who are very smart. Their offspring have an extended juvenile period, and they live in what are called matriarchal pods of grandma, daughters, and grandchildren. So grannies and aunties have a kind of shared reproductive strategy of helping to raise babies. And it's just interesting that these are smart, playful, blubbery critters who live in water. I'm just saying. Okay, so let me skip way ahead. I'm not going to talk about any of this. Okay, to wrap up, I just want to point out the human story could be told another way. And there are reasons to believe evidence is accumulating in favor of this alternative human story actually being the human story. So we evolved under conditions of abundance, of watery playfulness, not of hardscrabble aridity. Fat was important. Grandmas, aunties, and of course, mums was important. And all of these features are kind of the soft bits of human evolution. It's not the fault of like the patriarchy that fat doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record, but it has biased. We've paid a lot of attention to bones and stones. We haven't paid attention to fat. We haven't paid attention to fiber technologies, which I'm not going to talk about today. So the erasure of women that we see in policy today has also happened in scholarship. I think it began around the same time because I think these ideas were burbling up in the 1970s and then they were squashed and now they're like coming back. So these erasures can't be sustained in the face of evidence. We're seeing it start to crumble and hooray, it's exciting. Okay, thanks so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to be here. And that's it from me.
We're going to go now to Leah Carvalho. She's from Portugal. She's a woman who's always stood up for equity, defending women's rights, and who considers that radical feminism really fights for women, working with facts and evidence. Leah is an archaeologist by profession and a social science enthusiast with labour and social anthropological experiences, mostly in Portugal and Brazil. And the title of Leah's talk today is Gender Identity in Portugal, Digital Guidelines. So thank you so much, Leah, for coming and speaking, and over to you.
Hi, sisters. Well, as an archaeologist, I was digging in some browsers, just searching for the word transgender, and I found some articles from some newspapers and associations, and I bring us the data that I found when I make these searches. So according to an article that I found quite complete from January of this year, there is no data on how many trans people there are in Portugal. It is known that 185 adults and between 10 and 15 children are being monitored at University's Hospital Center of Porto's University. According to the government's Institute of Registration, in 2020, the registry services received 233 requests to change the mention of sex or first name, with the number growing in 2021 to a total of 400 requests. In 2022, the trend continued up and the services registered 492 requests until November. It is the most significant jump since 2017, when the number of people who started their identity in the civil registry rose from 89 to 146, 64% more. A normal trend, simply says Sasha Montfort from Association Transmission, a trans and non-binary association. As indicated in a news item on the subject, another piece of news refers that alterations are mostly from female to male. It was from 2019 that the process streamlined. In addition to allowing the change for those aged between 16 and 18, through legal representatives, almost 1,016 in total completed the process. But there are few who managed to undergo the surgical procedures to change their identity in the National Health Service, currently in charge of the Hospital and University Center of Coimbra in the Genital, Urinary and Sexual Reconstruction Units that I'm going to refer as ERGS. It's Cynthia. In 2020, 13 surgeries were performed. The main procedures were 2 vaginoplasties, 1 phalloplasty, 5 hysterectomies, and bilateral adnectomies. Sorry, but these are kind of difficult words. In 2021, 54 were performed, 15 vaginoplasties, 4 phalloplasties, and 10 hysterectomies and bilateral adnectomies, with or without vaginectomy. Yeah, vaginectomy. Jaime Moura, 19 years old, a psychology student from ex-ACO, that is an association for trans people, is another of the associations involved in the streets actions, points out that health is one of the areas where discrimination is felt the most. So he says, in Portugal, access to healthcare is limited. There are few professionals prepared to interact with trans people, and it's not just from a clinical point of view. And surgeries take years. The first consultation at ERGS has an average waiting time of 3 months, assures Susana Pinheiro from the association. However, demand has been growing, putting more pressure on waiting times. The time between the first consultation, which will always be sexology, and the first surgical intervention is very variable, depending on whether the transsexual person is undergoing startup process at Ergos, or if she is already referred from another sexology or endocrinology consultation just to perform surgeries. She explains this. Usually, the first surgery in male transgender people is a bilateral mastectomy, the removal of the breast. And in female transgender people, it is genital surgery. The trans community claims security, access to job, and decent housing. They also want the legislation to be changed for those who do not identify as female or male. Non-binary people are not recognized. We want this recognition. Portugal, which has been innovative, namely in the gender self-determination law, and now could make this legislative change similar to what already happens in other countries. Defends Joe Rodrigues, non-binary transsexual, which should make it unnecessary for them to say whether they are female or male. Puts M or F in the citizen card, which was not mentioned in the identity card. Society, in a way, is creating an inclusive environment. We have more people who are against it, but also more who are respectful of individual rights. On the other hand, this increase is a reflection of the 2018 law. 4 years later, it's normal that the numbers are increasing, since until then, it was a much more bureaucratic and evasive process. Explains João Rodrigues, 26 years old, a doctor in the first year of hospitalization and president of the Anemone Association, another association that was created specifically for the promotion of health in the LGBTI+ community. With regard to minors, according to news on August 8th of Jornal de Notícias, around 154 minors have changed in the last 5 years their name and gender on their identification documents. In 2018, there were only 11. In 2019 and 2020, 16 minors requested the change, while in 2021 there were 30 requests. Last year, 45 young people aged 16 and 17 changed their name and gender of their identification documents. The overwhelming majority of requests registered since 2018 are from young people who have passed to the male sex. In Portugal, the law of self-determination allows adolescents to choose their sex from the age of 16. A case presented in the article summarized the child with interests considered of the opposite gender in a family context self-identified as modern and disconstructed in the way of thinking and living. It exposes the sexual orientation of the mother, that is a bisexual person, as well as her current homosexual relationship, and makes reference to the non-binary uncle of the child. Another case is from a 25-year-old barber and influencer who lived 18 years in a body that did not belong to him, and refers to the division of trans people into those who had undergone genital surgeries as transsexuals, and as a transgender, those who did not, as reductive and invasive, and that the second term, the transgender term, is a more inclusive and correct term. Data collected by Statista between April and May of 2021 through a survey involving around 1,900 100 people between the ages of 16 and 74 show that Germany and Sweden are the countries where most people identify as transgender, with a gender fluidity or non-binary gender, 3% of the population in each of the countries. Then India, Hungary, Argentina, Brazil, Russia, Canada, Australia, Spain, United Kingdom, and Chile with 2%, and South Korea, Italy, Peru, Malaysia, Turkey, Japan, Netherlands, Mexico, China, France, Poland, South Africa, USA, and Belgium with 100%. The World Association for Transgender Health is peremptory in reinforcing the need to reduce the stigma associated with gender nonconformity, not referring to it as a disease or a pathology. Regarding the possibility of changing sex before coming of age, during childhood and the pre-pubertal phase, according to Elsa Rocha Fernandes, a psychiatrist and guest lecturer at the Faculty of Medicine of Lisbon, the existing literature points out several pros and cons in relation to both social transition or hormonal at this stage. Among the factors in favor of social transition in prepubertal children and young people, the improvement of mental health in a population that has high rates of suicidal ideation is mentioned. It also refers to the fact that not accommodating the social transition can be considered a violation of children's autonomy, a psychological abuse, and that is an abuse of human rights, she explained. With regard to hormonal transition, taking pubertal blockers, such as testosterone and estrogens, during puberty can, in the case of those born male, decrease the growth of facial and body hair, prevent the development of a deeper voice, and limit the growth of genitalia. And in the case of people who were female at birth, the treatment limits breast development and stops menstruation. With puberty being especially uncomfortable and stressful, for those with gender dysphoria, the result of blocking the development of secondary sexual characteristics according to the sex present at birth can improve mental health by decreasing anxiety and depression, improving social relationships and with other adolescents, which can eliminate the need for future surgical interventions and reduce suicidal or self-injurious thoughts, she warned. The global issue and one of concern currently found in the literature in relation to the early transition in childhood and pre-puberty, says the doctor, goes through the concern with, among others, the side effects associated with the therapy used, such as short-term headache or weight gain, and in the long term, for example, decreased growth and decreased bone density and fertility in adulthood. While social transition and hormone suppression treatment at puberty may be reversible, other changes are semi-permanent or permanent, such as gender-affirming hormone treatment or surgical interventions, a factor that weighs especially heavily in decisions made. I wanted to show that if you make any kind of search, you are going to have this pro-trans speech.
Yeah.
So, and the sexual preferences, orientations, kinds of styles of living of the people are exposed to justify this speech in the articles, in the news. Yes, I'm against what I'm reading, of course, or I wouldn't be here. But I was really wanted to show you that it's what we find in the media. It's the speech that is been given to the Portuguese people also, right? And it has been difficult to fight against it, because anyone wants to be inclusive, and no one wants to be called a prejudiced person, or
Yeah.
well,
So the information that you've been giving us, is that the main information available in Portugal?
it is the most easiest to find. It's the information that you get by some articles of newspapers and associations that just pops when in the browsers when you make some search of the
Yeah.
theme of the trans theme. So yes, it is a speech that it's hard to read and to listen, but it has been what we are being exposed to here in Portugal also. And yes, and we like to be, as was referred here, we like to be a country that is joining the news, the political rights and the European conventions, and in the law itself, it says there we are making this law because it is the law that it is being applied in the other European countries.
So they're very much saying we're trying to keep in line with European. Yeah. And the numbers, you as an archaeologist, you said that you're using a sort of data mining, you're using the same digging that you do in archaeology. It's surprising to me that you've managed to find the numbers of people who have had surgeries and
the kind of
change.
surgery.
Yeah, yes. Is that freely available in Portugal?
Well, I found it in this article, and I was surprised too. In that, I'm going to be really honest, I was surprised also with the fact that in this article they talk a little bit of people who wants to reverse the trans process.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to find it here, and I can focus on that part there. It is more what we want to know actually, because for me as a radical feminist, there are some situations, some social situations that of course I want to listen the people that are in there, but I want to listen more the people who got out there. And I'm talking about themes like abusive relationships, prostitution, transgender people who found out that after all they are not transgender. So because we know that human brains have too many strategies to make us feel good where we are, even if we aren't in the right place.
Yeah. And I have another question. Is there much of a movement in Portugal of people fighting back against transgender ideology?
Not really. We have the WDI volunteer group here in Portugal. We have some media on social media. We have some groups that are critical to gender ideology, but in general, there are closed groups. People can't give their real opinion in the social media because we have the Facebook and Instagram blockers, instance with hates of speech, hates of speech, and etc. So there are some closed groups, but I think that we can't fight in the same proportion.
Yeah.
Because all the media are having a pro speech, and all the parties are or trying to get neutral or giving the support, because yes, the world is all over the world. This is the main speech to LGBT.
Yeah, mainly going that way. That's a real shame.
I have a part of a text with the increased incidence per year and per person, and then it said that in Portugal the theme is beginning to be studied, and in a dissertation called Poverty Suppression in Trans Children and Adolescents, a dissertation from the application to the master's degree in medicine, submitted in University of Porto by Eduardo Rosas, we can read one of the main arguments for limiting the access of transgender children, adolescents, and adults to gender-affirming therapies, whether pharmacological or surgical, is based on the existence of regret. It therefore becomes important to explore possible correlations between gender-affirming therapies, including pubertal suppression, and the development of feeling of regret. The reasons behind this choice to reverse the transitional process were studied through a survey carried out in 2021 and filled out by 100 individuals who decide to reverse their transition. Possible reasons for reversing the transitional process include exposure to discrimination, 23%, respondents feeling more comfortable identifying themselves according to their gender assigned at birth, 60%, fears related to possible medical complications associated with the transition process, 49%, and individuals conclude that the cause of their gender dissociation was related to reasons other than gender incongruity, namely trauma, abuse, or a mental illness, 38%. It is highlighted, and the majority of the study population, 55%, said they felt they did not receive an adequate assessment from their doctor before starting the transition process. So about this, I have knowledge of one case of a girl that claims she is 13 years old, and 12 to 13 years old, and she claims that she wants to be a boy. And the doctor, we have the called family doctors here in Portugal. They are the general doctor of her mother and hers, is kind of taking the association's guidelines. Of course, she is said to her that they are not so sure of what are they doing, but is going to study the most he can and help her the most he can, and then when she gets 16 with her mom's authorization, she can start the hormonal process. So there are doctors taking these guidelines, pro-trans guidelines. They are everywhere, okay? They can't, by law, they can't do things before the 16 years old of the adolescents, but we know that there are ones that wants to be inclusive and wants to help these children. I believe that the speech of the suicidal thoughts, it's one
the same thing, yeah.